Welcome to the Microcosm game setup and overview video. In this video, I will be describing how to set up the board game and provide an overview of how to play. The Microcosm game board takes place in the cross-section of a soil horizon underneath the primordial lakebed. Each soil layer differs in resources, sunlight penetration, and oxygen penetration. Resources are contained within the hexagonal spaces, while bacteria and spores can occupy the intersectional points between these spaces. The marker on the left side of the board keeps track of the oxygen penetration, and the marker on the right side keeps track of the number of bacterial colonies controlled by the player. Player boards are given to each player. They provide information on the survivability of each bacterial species and their metabolic pathways. Players use these boards to keep track of the resources and organelles they collect for their bacteria. Pieces are used to represent the bacterial organisms controlled by the players. Different bacterial species are indicated by their shape, and the assorted colors correspond to the player controlling them. Each of the bacterial species has a distinct metabolic pathway and soil conditions that they can only be placed in. Tokens represent the ATP currency present in the game, while the color assorted cubes represent resources such as CO2, H2, H2S, H2SO4, and CH4. Evolutionary cards can be drawn by the player during the game. The card goes into the player's hand and must be discarded immediately after their use. A player cannot have more than 5 cards in their hand and must discard one if the limit is exceeded. Organelle cards can be used to equip special abilities to one of the player's bacterial species. They are placed on the designated area on the player board when equipped. The effect of playing a card is described inside the box. The ATP cost is shown on the top right, and where the card must be placed when played is shown on the bottom right. To set up Microcosm, place the central board where it can be accessed by all of the players, and give each player a player board. Each player also starts the game with 10 ATP. Determine which player goes first, and then decide the turn order. Place the evolutionary card and organelle card decks where they can be accessed. On the central board, place the 2 oxygen penetration markers indicating the regions of high, low, and no oxygen. Place the initial resources as stated in the instruction manual on the hexagonal spaces on the board. Draw the first 6 cards in the organelle deck and place them face up. These make up the gene pool for this generation. The game is broken down into 3 separate phases: the action phase, the ATP collection phase, and the preparation phase. These phases make up one generation. The designated first player in the generation gets the first turn in each phase. At the start of the game, each player can place 1 bacteria and collect 1 adjacent resource for free during their turn. During the action phase, the player can perform the following actions: place a new bacterium, collect an adjacent resource, place a spore, activate a spore, draw from the evolution card deck, activate an evolutionary card from their hand, or gain an organelle from the gene pool. A player can only perform one of these actions during their turn. It is then followed by the next player's turn. Players continue to perform one action at a time until all players pass. Each of the actions have their own restrictions and specified ATP costs to perform. These can be found in the instruction manual. When drawing from the evolutionary card deck, the top 3 cards are drawn and the player must choose one to keep. The one that is kept goes into the player's hand, while the other 2 are discarded into the discard pile. When there are no more evolutionary cards left in the deck, shuffle the discard pile and use these cards instead. In the ATP collection phase, each player converts their collected resources into their respective ATP and byproducts as shown on the player board. In the preparation phase, the board is to be set up for the next generation to take place. The byproducts are distributed back onto the board in any of the adjacent spaces to the bacteria that produced them, determined by the player. Then, the oxygen penetration markers are adjusted corresponding to the type and number of bacteria present on the board, as detailed in the instruction manual. The remaining organelle cards in the gene pool are then reshuffled back into the deck. 6 new organelle cards are drawn and put face up to make up the new gene pool for the next generation. Now that everything is ready, the next generation begins. A new player is chosen as the first player. He or she can now play first in each phase. The first player to control 4 active bacterial colonies on the board wins the game. A colony is defined as 3 adjacent bacterial organisms of the same metabolic pathway, and then to be considered active, the bacteria must be in an area on the board with the correct oxygen and sunlight penetration.